right, welcome everybody to the Skaldic Archive. Really excited about this. Most of you know me, but this is my good friend now, Garrett, and he's going to be helping me out with this. He has a podcast that he's called the Bard's Archive. He's had some very cool guests on already, and we're kind of teaming up. The bards are kind of like the equivalent of the skalds from the Norse into the Celtic tradition. So we're kind of blending these podcasts and making it into one, and bringing on some very, very interesting guests. And yeah, first episode is going to be very exciting. What did you have in mind for the first show, Garrett?
All right, Thor. I was thinking we could talk about the Skalds in particular and Skaldic, and not just with that, but also poetry in Norse culture and history and its importance.
Mm. Yeah, so it's very cool that we start the first episode with this subject, because Skald is kind of, it's a lot more in depth, and they had a lot more functions than people think. The main function of the Skalds was for storytelling, and this is what we see in the Skaldic poetry. This is what we see from what most people know about Skalds in the history books. They told stories of the kings, they told stories of battles, and they did it in some kind of poetic form, various different poetic forms. But they were also keepers of history and news, as it turned into later on in time. But they were also, this is kind of getting into the things that people don't know about them. They were kind of spiritual experts too, and they were keepers of the language and the hidden meanings, the poetical metaphors, and all these things that people used to sing in very, very ancient times. Then when we get to the Viking Age, the Skalds were still going strong, but then they kind of started to get weaker and weaker, and their understanding of this ancient poetical language disappeared slowly after a while. And they were also, because of that, they were the ones who understood the true meanings of the myths. Most of the most reliable sources we have of our mythology and the gods and all things like that, those were written. We don't know exactly who they were written by, but it certainly seems like they were written by Skalds. But definitely the poetical metaphors were something to be understood by Skalds, and Skalds alone, pretty much, and everyone else would have a very difficult time understanding it if they didn't have the Skalds' help.
All right, so let's get started, particularly with the word itself, Skald, Skaldic. Is there a particular meaning behind that?
Yeah, so in Old Norse, it simply meant poet. That's how it's translated to. So it does everything, like from the evidence we have written in the Viking Age still today. It means basically just a poet with all the functions that I just told you about. But if we go a bit further back, and if we look at parallels of this word, we have the old High German Skaldsang, which means a song of praise or a psalm. And if we go back to very, very old times, it's skallis, a Proto-Germanic word for meaning like sound or voice or shout. And other Germanic languages have similar meanings, all kind of relating to sounds or song.
All right, so this is all relating to sounds and song. Now, what did poetry, besides being able to be a possibility to create a fun or rhythmic form of history or capturing down a tradition orally and then passing it down from one generation to the next? What was poetry also used in the Norse culture?
Oh, everything. It annoys the hell out of me sometimes how much they liked poetry. They just it wasn't just for skalds doing these things. It wasn't just the musicians. Everybody was writing poems. It was even the greatest, toughest heroes that wrote poems about, making bread, or like going traveling somewhere, or
How
if
many
they just
heads they
killed
cut off?
someone. Yeah, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So kind of like a death metal, but for real.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's the main thing that I don't know. I would like to ask you about bards. and how that developed. But one thing that is probably the biggest misunderstanding of the Skalds as the actual people that were alive in the Viking Age that were composing these poems. They were not wimps. They were some of the toughest warriors sometimes. They were some of the most beastly, brutal guys, some of them very unpolitically correct and vulgar. And yeah, they were not wimps like we think of, like poets from the Renaissance era, or you know, just kind of someone hired by the king to be entertaining. The Skalds were like very poetry was a very masculine thing back then, so they were respected in all ways.
Yeah. Well, in the medieval era, is actually more of jesters who paid fools that were hired by the king for entertainment.
Mm.
The bards initially originated from the Druids in ancient Ireland or ancient UK. A lot of people like to particularly say it was in Ireland with the Celts and the Gaels, their predecessors. So the bards, their job was to preserve information primarily from, as their start, their conception, it was the Druids or the Tardrua that wanted to share whatever knowledge from one generation to the next. The bards were the ones that had to convey that. And
so the bards and druids were two separate people, right? It was kind of they were working not together, but you couldn't be a bard and a druid necessarily. They were definitely two separate things.
Yeah, it was two separate things. The druids were, from the best of my research, this group that was a little secluded from society, and each member spent their time trying to learn something, and their whole goal was to learn all of the knowledge of the universe. And they played a great part in helping society out. Questionably, they did help with the construction of things like Stonehenge, since nobody from that time period was alive to have written it down. We don't know for certain.
Yeah.
But the Druids were very much in the UK. They were scientists, they were doctors, they were survivalists, and they taught things like animism and magic and medicine and astrology and what would be now today astronomy in its more primitive forms to society.
Yeah. I really like how you like spoke about their whole kind of broad kind of functions, and also how you related back to Stonehenge. So of course I mean, Stonehenge is so much the oldest records we have on druids are about 2,000 years, right? So of course they weren't called druids in Stonehenge, of course, but the main thing you pointed out that I really like is they had the same function. I don't care how far we go back. There were some groups of men, spiritual leaders, druids in the Celtic tradition. They would have been the Gothi in the Norse tradition. We have records of the Germanic tribes having the same kind of thing, spiritual leaders with the same function. We have the priests in ancient Greece. It's all the same kind of thing, and call them different things at different times or whatever, but they all had pretty much the same function.
Yeah, I feel like every culture, personally from my studies, roughly has the same thing. In ancient times, you'd have had somebody, eventually some group like the bards. There's always some kind of spiritual leader or group of human libraries. And everything always relates back to what a lot of cultures would have called the five elements: earth, wind, water, fire, and spirit.
But anyway, do you know what they might have been called? I know you had Craigenford on the other week. He would probably know if there was a name for them in Indo-European times. But yeah, anything that sticks out to you?
I didn't ask him that question. That didn't really come to mind. There's so much information covered within at least an hour and a half.
I'll have to ask him.
Yeah, we will have to have him on the show and ask him about that at some point.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. but I'm not too sure really what the earliest renditions of it would have been. Um, the earliest I ever see of any sort of spiritual leader documentation is an undisclosed location at somewhere, I think, around the Arctic Circle. I
Hmm.
don't know if you're familiar with Lost Cities with Albert Lynn. And so this episode particularly was on Stonehenge. And he found on this stone face, and because of its position, there's only certain times of the year you could actually see it in direct sunlight. But it is a particular scene depicting ancient stone, not ancient stone, ancient caveman beliefs of animism and shapeshifting, and
Hmm.
potentially even origins of the wild hunt, where they believed if you killed an animal and ate its flesh, it would become part of you. And if you wore its skin, you could in some way turn into or become partially infused with the animal while you wore its skin.
Hmm. Yeah, and we know this too. They believed in things like this because we found kind of the things like Heilung wares, like the antlers, the deer antlers on their head, and they've been like masks, and they're thousands and thousands of years old, and it's like a deer antler like skull, and they see the eyes and more like this, and they know for sure that that was used as a mask, as like a spiritual tool, and the oldest one is like 10,000 years old or something like that. So we know that, of course, they believed in these types of things.
Yeah. Was there any documentation that they had people trying to preserve any of those? Like, do we know what's the oldest records or potential record of any sort of skalds or people trying to record history in some way?
Yeah, the earliest mentions we have of skalds that were actually called by the name Skald is the early Viking Age, so the early 800s, and they're actually the oldest texts we have written from the Viking Age, or at least the oldest written evidence. Maybe the texts were recorded a couple hundred years later, but we can tell from the people involved in it and the poetical language and things like that the Skaldic poems are actually the oldest that we have. But this is, I mean, there's no telling how old it is. There's ancient Roman sources telling about the exact same thing. They don't call them by name, but they tell them how the Germanic tribes, they had elders that would sing these ancient songs, and they were the keepers of these songs. Tacitus Germania is the most famous source, but there are other ones like that from around the same time. So that's at least 700 years before the Viking Age. So who knows how far they go back.
All right. That's pretty interesting.
How about bards? Do you know about their? I mean, of course, we know it goes back to Celtic pagan times, so 300s,
I think it goes.
200s. But
I think it might go beyond that.
mm,
I think it actually started. My theory is, and I haven't been able to find anything that validates it, but my theory is it might go all the way back to the Gaels who preceded um, the Celts. The
mm,
Celts was when they started to expand and develop an empire. Is when people in Ireland began to expand and develop an empire,
mm,
and uh, like the Vikings, I think that was kind of when they lost touch with who they were and collapsed. So I think when the Gaels came about, that was when the Bards started, because at that
mm,
point, that was when the people were expanding and society was growing. And I think because society was expanding, that's why the Bards came about. So the Druids had some kind of middleman, if you would, that would convey whatever from one generation to the next in society.
mm. Yeah, very cool. And also cool how these things would have happened at different times, right? Of course, the Gauls in France, they were Celtic too. I mean, there were Celtic people in Spain and even in Turkey and southern Germany, places like that. So they would have had something like a bard too. But they just didn't last as long. They were Christianized and they became civilized, so we call it a lot sooner. But yeah, like you said, Ireland and Scotland, the pagan elements of Ireland and Scotland lasted much longer than everywhere else, and I think longer than we're led on to believe, at least in the history books.
Yeah. So I think this is something that was produced by, because normally people don't create or don't go through the challenge of creating something as at the time would have been complicated in society as a bard or a system for bards, unless the society had expanded upwards to a point to where you would have needed it. Mm-hmm. And back then, ancient people, life really sucked. I totally love the taste of fresh fruit, and I have blueberries and raspberries and black raspberries throughout my property. But let me tell you, it absolutely sucks having to go through the process of handpick blueberries and raspberries and black raspberries and then clean them off and do something with them and go through the process of preserving them.
And that would have been the least of their worries at that time.
Yeah, because you have things that would have eaten your food or tried to kill you. You would have had rabid animals running through town. You would have had
the village
try
down.
To, have like half a dozen children at least, because most of them would have died. If not during infancy or early childhood, they would have died by the time they were a teenager. So yeah, it was a pretty hard life that people had, and also, I mean, the kind of hand-to-hand warfare and invasion and combat would have just, and then trying to survive the seasons, let alone like trying to make it through. A lot of people nowadays complain about the mild winters we have, but if you're trying to survive through the 4 months, at least we get here, snow and temperatures below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That definitely back then would have been incredibly difficult to have to go through this entire like 4 month period of nothing growing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's it's the same thing in all the Northern European mythologies. That's why we have a much different attitude, and our myths are much different attitude towards the seasons than, say, the Greeks or the Romans, for example. That's because it was life and death for the people of Northern Europe.
Yeah. So I'm particularly interested in your theories on why people would have had skalds.
Yeah, and that's it's like you said, it's life was difficult, and people, they didn't write things down. Okay, maybe they did have some written in inscriptions, but not as not something that you could carve down on a little piece of wood and pass down through the generations. I mean, these stories are so incredibly long, and we think of all of these texts and all of these poems, even the shortest ones that we know of today, we're thinking, I can't remember that. How do you do this? But then this was the Skald's job. I don't know about the bard too, but it sounds like it. It was the job of these people to remember these ancient poems, these ancient stories, and thousands of them. It's really, that takes a full-time job, but it's a very, very important job too. And yeah, we kind of think today, like, how would they ever do that? How is this possible? But the same kind of thing still exists today. If you go to some tribal communities, people that still have these poetic oral traditions, they'll be singing the song by memory for 10 minutes or even longer. So it's not impossible. It was done, and that was their job basically, but it was a full-time job.
Yeah, it's a thing. One prime demonstration, I think it's the best one we have so far, is Native American culture. Because if you ever go to, like, over this weekend, I just went to a powwow, And you can see in all of their songs, there's some kind of action, or in all of the dances, there's always something that they're teaching, um, from one generation to the next. There's a particular kind of song where they're teaching people to duck in war from the arrows that are flying at their heads.
Ah,
Um, and there's another one. One woman told me when she used to do Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, um, she used to teach her scouts the scouting dances, or the scouting dance. I can't remember if it's one or multiple. And uh,
and all for memory, right? The songs and the dances,
all of
they
it,
still do for
all of it's
memory.
from the top, right at the top of their head.
Hmm.
Because there are all these different stories and things passed down orally.
Very, very cool. Yeah, and same thing. Same thing. I don't know what they're called, if they have a name for them too, but it
Yeah.
sounds the same as the skulls and the bards.
Yeah. Is there anything in the Sami traditions, if you know, like if they sing or do any
Yeah.
particular?
Yeah. What are they called? Nuotun? Now don't quote me on that because I can't remember right now. I think it's the Nuotun. No idea. No idea. I don't know. We can put it up on the screen here after, but it's yeah, that's what they're called, and it's basically the same functions. Spiritual leaders. They have the songs. They're the ones who play the drums and have the poetry. But yeah, same kind of thing.
It was kind of funny reading up on the bard's progression over the years, over the generations, I should say, because they went from just being these people that would carry poetically knowledge and traditions from one generation to the next, and then they would become historians for the hierarchy in society, and they also became genealogists. So for certain people who wanted to claim their land or something, they would have, or claim their name. This was kind of your insurance plan.
Hmm.
And afterwards, it was really the medieval ages when it started, that just started becoming a general term for anyone who was a poet or an actor, or kind of for the patron of the arts.
Hmm. Yeah. Same same kind of thing. The Skalds the skulls are actually one of the few things, and I guess bards too. I'm just sometimes I'm surprised at how much pagan things survive past the Christianization of some people. But I mean, it's at least 500 years when the Norse became Christian, and the skulls were still a very important part of society. But what happened is the poems in the Viking Age started getting very, very complex, very, very uh, elusive with hidden meanings, and kennings and heiti would be what they're called, and something that only skalds would kind of understand. So it definitely seems like the poems got even more cryptic towards the end of the Viking Age with the spirituality. Then Christianity came along, and then it kind of that kind of disappeared, and the skulls still existed, but they were more like you say, more like keepers of history. They might have done, speaking about genealogy and things like that when necessary, but the spiritual element to them was kind of lost, and also they lost the meaning to these very old poetical metaphors and hidden meanings. So that's what happened around the 1200s, and that's actually why Snorri Sturluson, which most people watching this know, the Prose Edda, one of the main sources we have on the Norse mythology and gods. That's exactly why he wrote that book. He says in the first couple paragraphs of the book, he wrote this book because the Skalds were starting to lose the understanding of what their language meant, and these old metaphors and hidden meanings, and that's why he wrote that book, so they could have a guide as to understanding these encrypted old poems.
Yeah. So do you know why also quickly, just to backtrack half a step, why there would have been loose meanings, or why there would have been a lot of cryptic messages, or very subtle.
No idea. It's just something they like to do, maybe. So I can give you a couple of examples here. I took some notes. There's kennings and heiti, right? Kennings, they're called genitive phrases, as linguists will call them, right? And they're basically a phrase that is referring to something else. So you can say the horse of the waves, right? What is a horse to a wave? That's a ship. So that means a ship. So the poem would be going blah 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 blah. The wave's horse, and that means the ship. And only some people would understand what that is. Then we have heiti, which is basically synonyms, but it's usually only one word or a quick phrase, and those usually referred to some elements of the mythology or the gods or something like that. Like Jaknis, shaking ground, means the sea. Thvinir's dyr, like Thvinir's beast, that meant shippo also. So it's those kinds of things, just so people can get a rough idea of what these hidden meanings were. Did they just kind of make these things just to be pompous and like arrogant so people couldn't understand? Who knows? Maybe there was a spiritual meaning to it. I don't know, but I can say that it's not something unique to the Norse world, especially these tribal peoples who kind of are believed to be taken over by a god, be possessed by a god in some kind of ritual or frenzy. They very often, when they get up to that ecstatic state, they're speaking in riddles, almost like they're not there, like it's something else took over them, something spiritual took over them, and it's making that not easy for everyone to understand. Yeah, is there any, because so of course the written evidence is going to be difficult too, but is there anything like that, so like in the inscriptions, anything like ogam, or is there like any weapons with some inscriptions on it that maybe ideally would reflect some kind of pagan Celtic belief, but is there anything that you know of that reflects that might be a bard's poem in that similar structure?
I don't know too much about the Bard's poems in particular. Um, I'm not very fluent on Irish or Old Irish, which also makes the deciphering process really hard, because now you actually have to decipher the culture. People can translate things into modern day English for somebody to understand, but you actually are going to lose some of the context. So there might be some of the meaning lost, which unfortunately we would have to have a part two with somebody who's a pro in the language.
Yeah, yeah.
But funny enough is that it's really more of like genetics and archaeology that gives any validation to some of our older stories. So the Tafdeduan, the battle with the Fomorians. I will just use that example. So that's a story, that's an old poem about the people who eventually inhabited Ireland. So they were the Fomorians, and they did battle with another group of people that came to Ireland. And it all got started because their leader, bellow, he had a prophecy that said he would die by his nephew in battle. And it became a self-fulfilling prophecy because he tried to lock away his nephew in a tower. And so I'm giving the Reader's Digest version. This is kind of like trying to read the Bhagavad Gita, and it's a very lengthy poem. The stories are very lengthy, especially when you go into the older translations. And genetically, we can prove certain possibilities. So we do know through genetics that the people who, at the time this story could have possibly taken place, so around the construction of Stonehenge, that time period, the original people who started building Stonehenge were actually killed. And this was all during the Stone Age. And it was the original Irish inhabitants were killed by people who came up from Spain. And we do know that Cyclops is a real syndrome. There's only but like 2 or 3 pictures you'll actually find on the internet of humans with this condition. Primarily now it only happens in third world countries when you see animals with Cyclops syndrome. And giantism, Baylor was described as rather giant. That is an actual condition. There are legions and tumors people get on their brains that will cause them to not stop growing. Andre the Giant, he was a giant. He was, that was a specific condition where he was a massive, massive person. How they came up with this whole idea that Baylor was able to shoot death rays out of his eyeball, I have no clue. That story is he and his dad were visiting some druids, and he looked into a poisonous concoction, and the poison got into his eye, and that's why he's always able to shoot lasers from it. I do not know if that's a reference to anything, or if they just wrote that down to make the story sound so much cooler. And so in that story too, people were the original inhabitants did fight this new group of people, and it ended in an absolutely horrific battle with one side being completely wiped out by another. So unfortunately, I have to become probably somebody who's an expert in older language in order to get that true, legitimate meaning to it, which hopefully one day I could learn the language. But in the poems, some of the poems, there are some specific things within the history that we can prove. So like I just said with this one example.
Yeah, so yeah, sounds good enough to me. I was hoping for a little verse somewhere in some bardic poem, but that's that's a very clear example going back to really ancient times. Even if the poems more modern, a lot of these stories and fairy tales and poems, maybe we don't have them recorded until the 1800s or something like that, but that's of course it comes from a much, much older time, and people don't just make these things up, those kind of crazy stories. So they come from a very much older oral tradition, either way. So it's that's not a Christian story, we can just say that.
Yeah, it is definitely not a Christian story.
Yeah.
All right. So, is there any poetry that has transferred from ancient Norse times upwards into today? Is there anything that's survived that like we use nowadays and wouldn't even know or understand or think about?
In Scandinavia, you might have found some in the past 100 years, our grandparents' generation or their great grandparents' generation. Not anything like an old Norse poem about the gods or anything like that, but most of them just old fairy tales or old songs that you can definitely tell comes from the oldest times, and even some, I believe, that have the same type of verse and structure as a typical Skaldic poem. There's a few different ones. There's probably 5-6 different structures that a Skaldic poem typically has, but definitely a couple in the in at least the 1800s that were sung pretty regularly that we can be pretty sure are a lot older.
Okay. So how would the Skalds have structured their poems?
Oh, that's lots of different ways. I can there are words that I forget now. There's a few different styles of poems. We can put them up on the screen again here, maybe. But they could be short. They could be very, very long. But it's usually in like bits of 4 lines and then going on like that, and verses. It's not that much different than a traditional poem telling a story that most people have read before. Things like Beowulf is very much related to Skaldic poetry, and it's one of the reasons why we think that the Anglo-Saxons had something like a counterpart of the Skalds, even though we don't have any direct evidence. Things like that. So it can be all types of different poems, but it's different structures. But yeah, that's about it.
All right. Um, so this can go anywhere from like Iliad and the Odyssey or an Edgar Allan Poe long poem to something that's just a few sentences.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool, cool. So is Beowulf what it was originally, or did it go through a few changes over the years?
Yeah, well, that's one of the oldest written texts we have in Old English, and yeah, but definitely from other things in that poem, it's we know that it was a story that was much older than that. I forget when Beowulf was written, if five, six, 700s, but we think the events happened sometime in the 500s based on like real kings that we've confirmed from other sources who lived around that time. So it's not like the movie. We can say it's not like Beowulf the movie, but yeah, it's I mean, most people in their middle school classes read the Beowulf poem at least. So yeah, that's the real deal. That's one of the oldest poems that we have.
Okay. So now I have to ask you a little bit about the background on that on what were the earlier and like what were some of the things that people would have read in middle school rather than the Chris Lambert film or the 3D animated film that came out about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, you almost have to, if people have the patience to read it. It is very long and it can be boring for people who aren't interested in it. But Beowulf is, yeah, it's a poem. It doesn't, it's it's not like a rhyming poem. It's not like a song, but it's something like a, what do they call it? An alliterative verse. I'm not good with poetry terms, things like that, but it's a poem telling of very old times and telling of legends and kind of blending legend with yeah, real life events. So it's one of those things that we don't know how accurate that story was, just because some big monster named Grendel probably didn't exist. But yes, we know it's based on some real events and some mythology at least. So it's that's basically what Beowulf is. If people are interested, they'll have to read the whole thing, I guess.
Okay. So with the poems too, the poems that survived, did we find man and myth mixtures often in the Skaldic poems?
Mm,
Or just in any sort of poetry that came out of Scandinavia
yeah,
people?
yeah, that's definitely all of the. Uh, they call them the Helgilays or the Sigurd cycle poems. It's basically, if people know the Nibelungen lead, the old German story about Sigurd and Brunhilde. Volsunga Saga, same story. A lot of people have read that. That's one that blends kind of mythology and real historical events. The Skaldic poems, though, not so much. You'll get some parts of it. Now, like I said, Skaldic poems that we have records of, they're mostly about the kings and the deeds of kings, and they're little pieces of sagas. You'll be reading a couple chapters, and then it'll come up with a few lines of a Skaldic poem that some Skald wrote about those events. There's a couple examples where they blend mythology in it, like when we speak about King Harald Fairhair, he went to Valhalla, and but nothing super clear about it. Like I said, they'll refer to Haiti and Kenning's kind of hidden meaning, and they'll refer briefly to like a giant or a god or something, but nothing that sticks out too clearly.
This was the brown bull of Cooley. Dark brown, dire, haughty, with your health, horrific, overwhelming, ferocious, full of craft. Furious, fiery, flanks narrow, brave, brutal, thick-breasted, curly, browed head cocked high, growling, and eyes glaring. Tough-maned neck, thick and strong, snorting mighty in muzzle and eye, with true bull's brow and a wave's charge, a royal wrath and the rush of a bear, and the beast's rage, and a bandit's stab, and a lion's fury. 30 grown boys could take their place from rump to nape, a hero to his herd at morning, foolhardily at the herd's head, to his cows the beloved, to husbandmen a prop, the father of great beasts, overlooks the ox of the earth, a white head and white feet, had a bull, a white head and white feet, had the bull Finnebonk, and a red body, the color of blood, as if bathed in blood, or dyed in the red bog, or pounded in purple, with his blank paps under breast and back, and his heavy mane and great hooves, the beloved of all cows, bay, the ponderous tail and a stallion breast, the cow's eye apple, and a salmon snout, and hinder haunch, he romps in rut, born to bear victory, bellowing in greatness, idol of the ox herd, the prime demon in a bonk. So I'm going to guess from reading that, that's just kind of a clear warning as to why you don't fight with cows. Because back then, those things were like 1,000 or more pounds.
Yeah, they're bigger than now. Yeah, I can definitely see some metaphors in there. I can definitely hear some tendings or Haiti. So definitely a little metaphorical language that you might find in a Skaldic poem.
Yeah.
All right, I'll read the first one. Everybody knows this. This is the My Mother Told Me song that gets played way too much. And, this is actually an original Viking poem. It's from Egil Skallagrim saga, and he composes this poem as a young boy after he had just killed someone, and he eventually turns into one of the biggest badasses of the Viking age, but he was always a poet. And this was one of his first poems that he ever wrote. And that is, that said my mother, that I shall buy for myself a swift ship and of a pretty oar to journey away with freebooters, to stand tall on the prow, steer a worthy merchant ship, direct it thus to the harbor, strike one man and another, strike one man and another. And that is like the actual lyrics of that song that everybody just knows of the poorly translated one. So it's not a poem written by a skald. It was Egil, apparently, if we're to believe that story, but it has every kind of element of a typical skaldic poem. Next one, I'm just going to read a couple lines of it because it's very long, and that is Hjalfensmal, one of my favorite ones, and that is basically an actual skald, one of the most clear examples of a skaldic poem that we have, and that is telling about Harald Fairhair's deeds and his death. And the way it's structured is it's a Valkyrie speaking with a king, or is it a Valkyrie speaking with a king? Yeah, it's a conversation between a Valkyrie. Oh yeah, it's a conversation between a Valkyrie and a Raven, actually, apparently. But we know this poem was written by a Skald. We even know the name of the Skald. His name was Thorbjörn Hromkofli. But yeah, apparently it was a speech between the Valkyrie and a Raven. And the first few lines are just, "Have you heard of the king, he who lives in Kvin, lord of all Norwegian lands, he who rules deep set keels, reddened spears and bloody shields, tar soaked oars, and foam flecked snails." So, of course, you can see some poetical metaphors in that one too, but you guys can go check out that one yourself if you like, and that's called Hejafensmal. Good podcast. This will be uploaded on both of our channels. So I'm uploading a short version on my channel, and then the full version you can catch on Garrett's channel. And there will be lots more coming with a lot more very interesting guests.